So for my human factors research presentation, I decided to focus on the principles of design and the principles of decision making. So I'll be talking a lot about what was discussed in the previous lectures with the principles of design and what those are and how that can influence our decision making. The first study that I looked at talked about how design can impact shares when it comes to the market. So this focused a lot on cars, but it still has to do with the principles of design that we discussed earlier in this class. So it really focused on how the price of company shares increased when new products were released. So it looked at a couple different products from different companies and said, so when this product was released, this was how it affected the shares and the stocks and their prices. So what they found was that the more well-designed a product was, the bigger effect it had on the stocks. So when a product was well-designed and really focused on those principles of design and what would make customers happy, then the stock price went up much higher than when it was not designed with those principles of design in mind. The second study that I looked at was from one of the videos that we watched in class. So this was the study where they talked about irrational decisions. And I focused on when they talked about organ donation based on country. So in this study, they found that some countries had much higher rates of recorded organ donors than a bunch of other countries. And they were looking into this. They were confused if it was cultural reasonings or ethical reasonings. But what they ended up finding was that it was how the forms for licenses were designed. So they found that countries that had lower rates of organ donors had a box on their license forms that said, check this box to be an organ donor. And the countries with higher rates of organ donation had the same thing, but instead of saying to check it if you wanted to be an organ donor, it says to check the box if you do not want to be an organ donor. So because people are kind of going fast, they're not really checking what extra steps there are. It was overlooked a lot. And so that is why different countries had different rates of organ donation based on which question they used. It wasn't how ethical or cultural effects were placed on organ donation. It was all about the way that the question was designed. So the last study that I looked at is kind of most important when it comes to my proposed research topic. And this was also from the video that the irrational decisions study came from. It was later on in the video, and this is where they talked about the 3 different computer-generated heads. So in this study, there was 2 computer-generated heads that were made to be very attractive based on societal standards, basically. But they were different enough that you could tell them apart. So the participants that were gathered were split into 2 different groups. The first group was shown both of the first heads, and then a third head that was a less attractive version of head number 1. And then the same thing was done for group number 2, but instead of the third head being a less attractive version of head number 1, it was a less attractive version of head number 2. So what this study found was when there was a less attractive version present, the participants were more likely to choose the attractive version. So in group number 1, where they had both of the regular heads and the less attractive version of head number 1, they found that head number 1 was more attractive than head number 2. And the same was true for group number 2, where they had the less attractive version of head number 2. They chose head number 2 as a more attractive version more often than not. So my hypothesis for my research is that I think that when we combine the product design with decision making, we can really influence what product a customer is going to choose. So I'd like to recreate the third study, the one that I talked about last, which was the study with the 3 different heads. But instead of using faces for this, I want to use a chip bag. So this way we can look at what happens when there is a more well-designed version of the same different chip bag? Is it going to be chosen more likely? Will the results be the same as that third study that I just talked about? I hypothesize that it will, that by combining product design and the fact that we know consumers make irrational decisions, we can really influence the product that a customer is most likely to decide on and to purchase. So the next thing we need to look at is the participants I want to use. So I don't really have a strict, I only want males or I only want females. I want a mix of participants, including a mix of different age and gender. So the only real groups that this would exclude is young children that don't shop, including teenagers that don't shop for themselves. This would also include college students that have meal plans that aren't actually going to the grocery store on a regular basis, as well as elderly people that don't do their own shopping, whether they have someone that brings it to them or if they get it delivered online. And then this also excludes anyone that doesn't go into the store. So now we have like Walmart, you can pick your products online and then they come out and bring it to you. So if you do that, then you would not be eligible to participate in this study. So the groups would be well mixed. I would have all of the different ages, genders, everything that were able to participate, and then I would have an even mixture of those throughout both of the two different groups. So the next thing is the different materials that I would need for this study. So I'm going to end up needing 4 different chip bags in total. The first chip bag would be a well-designed yellow chip bag. The second would be a well-designed blue chip bag. And then the third bag that I would want would be the same as the first chip bag. It would be yellow, but the design would be different. It would be more poorly designed with text that was harder to read. And then the fourth would be the same thing as the third, but instead of being yellow, it will be blue, a more poorly designed version of bag number 2. So in this, I'll have the 2 base chip bags for each group, as well as a third poor design of one of the previous designed chip bags. So this will show, it'll be the same as the 3 different heads from the study that I'm basing this on, but instead of using the 3 different heads, I'm using different chip bags. And then the only other thing that I would really need would be a building or room to house the participants so that they could come in one at a time and be able to look through the different chip bags and make their decision. So how this research will be done is that the participants will be divided into 2 different groups. The first group will be presented with chip bags 1 and 2, the well-designed yellow and blue, and then they will also be shown the third chip bag, which is the less well-designed version of number 1. Then they will be asked which chip bag they would be most likely to buy. The second group will have the exact same thing with 1 and 2, but instead they'll have chip bag number 4 instead of number 3, which is the poorly designed version of number 2, and they will also be asked which chip bag they would be likely to buy. And there's no prices or anything to influence this, it's based solely on the design of the bags. So I expect to see similar, if not exact, matching results to the third study that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation. I expect that group 1 will choose the first chip bag because they were presented with the poorly designed double, and the same will be true for group number 2. They'll choose the second chip bag more often because they had the poorly designed double of the second bag. So this would prove the irrational decision making, that there's not like a conscious decision that's happening there. It's just whatever seems best in the moment. And it would also support the principles of design. And this really looks at not only the first study I talked about, but again, both of those 2 principles are kind of tied together in that third study I discussed previously.